Hey everyone, this is Bathymetrics. Today I'm going to be talking about the new Gullfoss for Windows. That's this plugin right over here. I'm also going to be talking about Smart EQ2. This isn't precisely new. This came out around November, and there's been an earlier version of it for much longer, since about 2017. But I picked this one up recently because it occasionally goes on sale for a good price. I think I got this for $69. And Gullfoss right now is kind of in an early access version for Windows. It just came out a week ago, maybe last weekend. And it's currently on sale for a really good price too, kind of an introductory price for a while. So figured I'd make this video after beating my head on Gullfoss, especially for about 4 days. Now that I've really wrapped my head around it, it's a great plugin, and I'm going to try and demonstrate why. But it's also a very confusing plugin at first until you wrap your head around it, and I'm going to help you understand that. If you just buy Gullfoss and think that it is some magic AI EQing plugin, you're going to be really disappointed with it. You're going to try to use it. It's going to sound terrible, and you're not going to want to buy it. But if you know how it works and you know the secret to making it work well, then it's pretty damn nice. So without further ado, let me just quickly demonstrate a track and show you what Gullfoss and to some extent Smart EQ can do. This track is some sync work that I'm doing for a YouTube creator. It's not especially bass heavy. It's not like a big bass heavy banger like I often make. This is a little more balanced in its tone. The bass sits about in the middle of the broad spectrum for bass heavy music, so it's not a banger. Keep that in mind. This is a little more upbeat and lively, and it's a sync track. So with that in mind, let's hear the track with Smart EQ bypassed and also with Gullfoss bypassed. And this is the basic mix I'm working with. Okay, so if you're not familiar with setting the slope of your spectrum analyzer, this is set to a pink noise slope. It's a -3 dB per octave roll-off. So basically, pink noise looks exactly flat across or straight across in the spectrum analyzer. And for electronic music and EDM genres, which are typically much brighter than other genres, that's a really helpful thing because you can sort of mix by eye and balance things by eye just for making sure your frequency spectrum looks pretty much straight across, like you saw here, like it's just filled up evenly end to end. And in the bangers and the really heavy festival-oriented genres, you might see the low end push up above that flat line, but pretty much everything from about 700 hertz or 500 hertz all the way through about 12K to 15K is going to look pretty flat across, right? And then in heavier music with really big subs and stuff, you're going to start seeing it slope up here above the flat line. Now, this is tonal balance control. If you've never seen this before, it's from Isotope. It comes with Ozone Advanced and also maybe Neutron 2 Advanced. And this is specifically their bass heavy curve, which is, they analyzed a whole bunch of bass heavy tracks and they came up with this average curve. And you have this broad view and you also have this fine view. So this is like another at a glance reference curve to see how your mix is doing. And then it also kind of shows you the overall crest factor. If this little dot is hovering closer to the part that looks like a sausage, you've got a very compressed track. If it's over here by this thing, you have a highly dynamic track. And, ideally for mixing and mastering, you want your crest factor going into the mastering limiter and your final process. You typically want it to be in between these two dark lines. So this mix, as you can see, is set up really well just for the basic raw mix before I start doing anything fancy on the mix bus, like a final EQ curve, like I'm going to demonstrate here with Smart EQ. So let's look at that one more time. So you'll notice in this view over here in tonal balance control, you can see that the sub area, the bass area is hitting right down the middle. The low mids are a little bit below average, right? It's a little depressed, a little scooped out. The high mids are about average, and then the highs were a bit brighter than average. The line was sitting kind of up here. And that's because this has a lot of shakers and cymbals and stuff, and there's not a lot to this track. There's only about 20 different elements in the track, and so to fill out that high end and keep it nice and bright and having some energy, the cymbals are kind of taking over the mix a little bit. So that's usually the kind of thing that you could either do some really exacting surgical EQ all over your drum and percussion bus to like really rein that in, or you could just try and fix it in a mixbus EQ, which is what's happening here with Smart EQ. So I'll circle back and show you how Smart EQ works, but for now I'm just going to unbypass it so that you can hear what the curve I came up with is doing to the mix. So this is the basic mix, and then I'm going to unbypass Smart EQ and kind of toggle this on and off and let you hear it for a sec. Okay, so hopefully you agree that it sounds better with Smart EQ engaged. You can see the Smart EQ is doing some very gentle, mixing level type curves, mix bus typical curves. Not too much push or pull, except a little bit more extreme at the high end and low end, especially since I have a little bit of extra roll off sitting right here. If I turn that off, this is what Smart EQ would have done by itself. See how it just dipped about 3 dB through this range and then even left the top end alone, the very top end. But I added an additional slope on that. So let's also look briefly at how Smart EQ makes this set of curves and reference curves shape up. Again, when it's bypassed, remember that the bass was sitting here in the middle. This was a little bit depressed. This was about right, and the highs were a little high. It was up here. So watch what happens with Smart EQ engaged now. So you can see it pushed up the sub a little bit, the sub and bass area. It pushed up the low mids a little bit. It even brightened the high mids a tiny bit, and it definitely brought the highs down, which is exactly what this curve tells you it's doing. If we look at it in the fine mode, isotope. So that's like a really solid mix bus EQ curve going into your final process, your final bits of compression and saturation and tonal coloring and limiting and all that stuff, right? Pretty good mix, pretty solid mix. So now let's examine what happens when we unbypass Gullfoss on top of this mix. And if you've read anything about Gullfoss so far, you'll notice I'm doing extremely low settings for recover and tame, not even tweaking the bias at all. I'm not brightening it at all. What I am doing, however, is a little bass heavy compensation and warmth, because I did want this a little bit heavier on the bass, and I was curious how well Gullfoss would handle this, like what it would do to the low end. So I'm going to warm it up a little bit, and you'll see that shown here pretty well. You're going to see the sub and bass area line sitting a little bit higher than mid-range now. It's going to be sitting around here. So this is Gullfoss bypassed and unbypassed, and I'll just toggle it on and off a few times so you can hear for yourself the difference. Okay, so unless you're listening on really good headphones or you're in your studio and you're listening on your good monitors in your well-treated room, you may not have heard much of a difference. But if you're listening on good gear, you're going to hear that Gullfoss is opening up the mix. You typically hear this term, it's like opening up the mix a little bit. It's doing a lot of things actually. Uh, because of this boost setting, I'm also warming up the sub a little bit, warming up the low end a little bit. But mostly what Gullfoss is doing under the covers in a way you don't notice in the context of this full mix unless you're listening close, is it's really taming some harshness. It's kind of improving the correlation. It's kind of improving the stereo imaging ever so slightly. And it's toning down the highs and the upper mids where the pain range can be for snappy things like the snare snap or the clap snap, the cymbals, things like that. It's taking the edge off, and yet it's still keeping it fairly bright. And I could brighten it a lot more with this thing, but it just makes the mix smoother and easier to listen to without noticeably recoloring it, right? Without like what would happen if I just pulled down the high end a little bit or tried pulling down in this pain range here around, the 2 to 6, 7K range to get rid of some harsh, snappy resonances and stuff. Gullfoss just does that for you automatically. Now, this will become more apparent when I come in here and start soloing different bands for you and letting you hear the difference. But let's try this one more time. I'm going to bypass a little bit faster this time. So again, before and after. Now, if you're listening on good gear, you'll also notice that when it's bypassed, the whole mix feels a little boxy compared to the open mix. And that's kind of where that word openness, I think, comes from, is a good sounding mix that fills the spectrum correctly and fits the tonal reference curves correctly and everything can still sound a little bit, I don't know, congested in the mid-range, boxy in the mid-range, even though technically the boxy region around 400 and 500 hertz isn't actually that boxy. It's just this overall feeling of the mix is a little more mid-rangey and crunched together in the center, right? And as soon as I engage Gullfoss, it just opens up, and it's neat. Check it out one more time. Okay. If you play back that section really loud, like as loud as you can stand it, to the point where when it's bypassed, your ears are starting to feel a little pressure from the snappy, harsh, resonant things going on with the snare and the clap, you'll notice that every time I kick on Gullfoss, it gets smoother, and that subliminal pressure on your ears, it says there's way too much resonance happening in the harshness zone. That pressure just drops, it goes away. So Gullfoss is cool, but it's very subtle. It's very subtle. So the way I like to describe it is, I'm going to put it like this. People will buy Gullfoss thinking that it's some automatic AI EQ thing that will magically make your EQ sound good. And I'm here to tell you that it won't. If you don't send a signal into Gullfoss that is already pretty well spectrally balanced and is already a tight mix, Gullfoss will sound like crap. Absolute crap. It will not fix a bad mix. A way I can put it is Gullfoss is really good at polishing a diamond, but it will not polish a turd. In fact, all it'll really do is make the turd smell stinkier. Okay? It's just that simple. To make Gullfoss work and to get the right sound out of Gullfoss, to hear the magic that it can do, you've got to start with a good mix before you engage Gullfoss. Gullfoss comes after you've set the mix and set your spectral characteristics and made a nice balanced thing. So that's the key for Gullfoss, is don't just throw it on your mix bus and turn it on and expect it to just do magic, because it won't. Not unless you've already done your homework first. So let's go a few more things real quick. Let's do a little bit of band-specific comparison so you can hear more precisely what I've been trying to describe in the overall sound. Um, I like metric AB a lot for referencing tracks and also just for checking various areas of the mix because it's got some nice things going on in the filter section, as you'll see here in a second. So let's let's bypass Gullfoss again. Let's go to the mid-range and check that out first. Now, you don't have to listen very hard to really hear that kind of boxiness versus opening up I was talking about. Now, this is just where most of the mid-range is, where most of our sensitivity as humans is right in this range here. And you'll notice it sound a little tinny and mid-rangey and boxy and congested when Gullfoss was off. You'll also notice that the snap of the snare slash clap in this thing plus the hi-hat pattern, a little bit snappy, it's a little bit sharp. It's putting too much pressure on your ears. As soon as I kick in Gullfoss, it just smooths out. It's still just as bright, but that snap stops being harsh. Listen to it again. Actually, let's start with the bypassed version. So if you go back and replay that short segment at the loudest volume you can stand, you're really going to hear the difference in how Gullfoss cleans up the harshness really nicely. I mean, it's every bit as good to me as Soothe or Ozone Spectral Shaper or BX Refinement. I mean, I'm not even going back to the instruments that have harshness in them and fixing them. I haven't done that. I wanted to see how Gullfoss would do, trying to do it all at the mix bus level, and frankly, it's doing a great job at that. So that's like a nice fast speed up. If Gullfoss can take care of the harshness, then, you know, saves you a lot of time going back trying to dial that out on specific tracks and specific sounds. So let's check out another interesting range, which is kind of the low mids. Now, by default, metric AB doesn't really hit the range I like to hear. I like to listen to the mud range from 150 to about 400. But this is also a good range to dial in on. So I'll start with this, and then I'll change the range to the 150 to 300, 150 to 400 range, roughly, where the mud happens. This is kind of like edging into the upper mid range. What's really interesting and hard to tweak a lot of times is everything happening between about 500 and about 120. So I'm just going to go back and forth a little bit, let you hear the difference for yourself for a minute. So bypassed. Okay, so in this range, not a lot of big difference between Gullfoss and not Gullfoss, and that's because this range is actually in pretty good shape. You might have heard the snare become a little more present here when Gullfoss was on, but we're not really listening to the real problem area yet. So let's drop this down a little bit to 150 on the low end, or about 120. And let's take this all the way down and just focus on the mud range first, because this tells a good story. So the mud range is, you know, roughly between 150, 350 or 150, 400, depending on how you think of it. And this is where your bass and your kick and other things can get a little congested and mask each other, and just all the bassy things going on with the low end of your various sounds versus your kick and your sub. This is where they all get mangled. So check out what Gullfoss does here. We're going to start out bypassed. So if you go back, replay that section and turn it up really loud so you can hear really carefully, just when I toggled Gullfoss on and off, what you'll notice if you listen close is that the kick, the energy of the kick, that punchy body, well, not the punchy body, the body of the kick was getting masked a little bit by the low end bass, and kind of the string sections have their own bit of bass creeping into this area. And so there was the kick's a little bit masked. The kick isn't as defined as it could be in here, but as soon as I engage Gullfoss, the kick becomes a little more present in this range. Let's listen to it one more time. Now, after I told you what to look for, I'm guessing even at a lower volume level, you noticed the subtle difference in the kick there. The kick was a little bit more unmasked. And for what it's worth, I haven't done any side chaining in this project because, again, I wanted to see what Gullfoss would do. And I'm pretty impressed with it. Of course, side chaining the kick would make it stand out where it really needs to. But the point is, Gullfoss is cleaning up this mud range a little bit. Now let's focus a little bit on the boxy range. Let's just go up here at about 200 to 500. Thereabouts. Okay, Gullfoss off. And again there, if you're used to listening for boxiness, you can hear that Gullfoss was relieving some of the boxiness. Now let's just expand this out and listen to kind of a broader range about like this. So with this full range between about 100 and about 900, or about a 1K, there you can really hear the difference when you toggle Gullfoss on and off. You heard the kick become more prominent. You heard the whole thing open up and become less boxy, right? One more time. Okay. It also kind of slightly tamed the stabs of the string sections when they come in with wah, 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 wah. They're very stabby, and I've already done some mild compression on those, but Gullfoss is reining those peaks down a little more, reducing the dynamic range slightly. So Gullfoss is doing some really nice stuff here. Now let's go listen to the very highs. And this isn't the highest highs. This is starting at about 4K. I often will start at about 8K for something like this, but let's do what Metric AB wants to do by default first. Gullfoss bypassed. Now that should be a huge difference to you, even at low volume. You can hear how that the harshness, the snappy harshness of the clear and the hi-hats just gets smoothed out noticeably, even at low volumes. And if you turn it up to the point where it's really painful to your ears, you'll hear the difference instantly when I bypass Gullfoss on and off. One more time. So see, that's the fine line we often play when we try to add air and brightness and brilliance back to our mixes, especially if you have trouble getting enough into your arrangement in the first place, is you'll crank all sorts of things in there and you'll put on Mag EQ air, or you'll play your games and you'll layer your sounds, and you end up with this harshness that in the whole mix, it can be hard to hear, but you wonder why your ears are getting fatigued. And it's because of too much happening here, too many resonances from all the stuff you've added. And Gullfoss just does an amazing job of pulling those down. And it's worth noting that in Gullfoss, I've even told it, hey, I want you to not work quite as hard at doing what you do starting at 10K. I want you to actually like do less here than you normally would, right? And it's still doing a wonderful job of cleaning up that harshness in the high end. So again, if I take this range and let's go all the way up first to about 8K where the extreme highs are. We're just going to look at 8K and above. And I think even there, if you listen close on good gear, and especially if you turn it up, again, you can hear that pressure, that sort of edginess, that thing that you don't really know why, but it's fatiguing your ears. It's making it a little unpleasant to listen to. It just goes away when Gullfoss does its thing. And again, I'm telling Gullfoss, don't even work as hard from 10K up. That's what this red band here is. And now let's expand this out and go down a little bit, all the way to like, let's start at about 1K. We're just going to listen to every place that pain happens and where human hearing is the most sensitive. There we go. So bypassed. Now, the main thing I want you to notice there is when you listen to that range where there's a lot going on and a lot for your ear to process, it doesn't sound that different when you turn Gullfoss on and off, right? The overall brightness felt the same. There was no big shift suddenly in the color. Even the snappiness of the snare and the hi-hats felt kind of the same, right? It wasn't as pronounced a difference as when I narrow it in on certain bands to really show you what it was doing under the covers. The point is, across the mix, all of these things add up, and in a very subtle way, they just improve and open up the mix. And because I was doing a little bit of boost in Gullfoss, which basically boost means they push up the low end a little bit and they drop the lower mid-range, or really all the mid-range, they drop the mid-range a little bit. It's kind of like an old boost button on old hi-fi gear, right? Push up the bass, pull down the mids, and that increases a sense of loudness and warmth. And it's very subtle. They're very subtle about it. And then they also have a brighten control that I haven't shown you yet. But if I wanted to bring back some brightness or even add air to the mix, this is one of the best ways I've heard to add air, period. If you want to add just a tiny bit of extra shine and brilliance, kicking this up even to 17% or 20% can do a lot. In fact, let's listen to that right now. I'm going to take and display the whole mix again. And we're going to do Gullfoss on. So now I'm going to bypass Gullfoss on and off with just a little bit of brightness added. Hear how that adds air, but not in an annoying way or a harsh way? It's just sweet. It's just sweet, tiny amounts of gentle brightness. So this is a fantastic tool. I think the best way, the best analogy I can give you is it's like if you've ever tried sharpening your kitchen knives or sharpening a pocket knife, or have anyone who's done that or ever thought about how do you do that? You know, typically you use these different sharpening stones that are kind of coarse at first, and then you move to a more medium coarseness, and then finally you move to an extra fine coarseness on the sharpening stone. And you can get a knife pretty sharp that way, but you can't get it razor sharp until you pull out a leather strop with some stropping compound on it, and you run the knife backward across the strop in both directions, right? And it's barely touching the metal, and yet somehow just stropping it about 20 times will put this razor edge on your knife. It just takes off all the little microscopic burrs that are left on the edge, and it just will make the knife like able to pop hairs or slice paper easily or whatever, assuming you have a good edge, right? So to me, Gullfoss is like a strop. It's like, you know, it's not a wrench, it's not a hammer, it's not a big coloring EQ like a typical mixbus EQ or bus EQ. It's a very fine strop that just does some final fixing and tweaking in some subtle ways that add up to this openness. And again, I'm running this at very low settings. You can screw your mix up if you try to go too hard with Gullfoss. You'll thin it out too much, or you'll do this or you'll do that. So if I were to give you a method for testing Gullfoss and setting up Gullfoss, I would basically say, you know, use something like Smart EQ or your best mixing know-how. Get your mix as solid as you can get it, right? Then bring out Gullfoss and put it on after whatever your final mix bus EQ might be. And start at 25-25 for recover and tame. None of these other settings, boost, brighten, or bias, they don't do anything unless there's some degree of tame and recover. And what these are basically is tame alone is like soothe or ozone spectral shaper, in that it's dynamically looking for the harshest resonances all across the spectrum, and it's pulling them down slightly. That's what taming is. It's taming resonances. And then recover is actually looking for the opposite. It's looking for the sounds that are a little buried in the mix, the kind of opposite of resonances, the valleys in between the higher fundamental and harmonic peaks that are popping across your spectrum. And it's actually pushing those upward. So a setting like recover 24 and 25 tame is kind of like 50 tame, but different, right? So my best advice is, to me, Gullfoss sounds best if you give it a little bit of recover, a little bit of tame. Don't overdo it. Start with that. And then if you feel like Gullfoss is thinning your mix out too much, or if just in general, like, start using your ears after you've set these two. Just use your ears. Stop looking at meters so much and just play with the boost. Say, do I want to warm it up a little bit? Yeah, that sounds good. Or no, I don't need to warm it up. Do I want to brighten it a little bit? Put a little air in the top end? Well, let's play with the brighten. Take it up or down a little bit. And then this bias knob basically adjusts the ratio of how Gullfoss decides whether to tame something or recover something if it's not sure, if it's like right on the borderline of its thresholds for deciding whether to use a tame push down or a recover push up. Bias will influence that a little bit and say, well, if you're not sure, use tame. If I push this up positive, it's going to tame more than it's going to recover, I think. Look at the manual. And if you pull it into a negative zone, it's going to recover more than it tames on those borderline situations. So it's kind of like you can set these two numbers pretty much equal to each other, and then just play with the bias to decide, you know, which sounds better. Just go a little bit on either side of zero. And that's the best way to use Gullfoss, is go easy. Start with 25-25. Probably you're going to want a little boost, but again, it just depends on the song. In this case, I wanted to warm it up a little bit. And then finally, you know, you've got these exclusion bands where you say, don't work on these areas of the spectrum. And by and large, honestly, I thought I would want to be excluding the sub-region a lot, but if you give Gullfoss a good mix, you can let it work even on the sub-region, and it actually does some magic. It doesn't hurt anything. What I find interesting is that for the high end, Gullfoss will often get a little aggressive right up here, and you'll see a little peakiness. Like, here, let me kick this on. See that right there, that little peak that was happening here? Gullfoss can get a little bit extreme here depending on what you're feeding into it, because remember, I've got a fair bit of roll off on my EQ right here. Watch what happens over here in this part of the spectrum when I play it. So you see how I've got, a typical kind of, it's not so aggressive after about 12K, it starts sloping downward. And again, that's what tonal balance wants a song to do. See how it starts sloping down a little more sharply over here? One more time. Let's bypass Gullfoss so it's not influencing things. Isotope steals my keyboard focus. So see, this EQ curve that I'm doing is already like shaping the high end to sort of fit good reference averages, right? So Gullfoss comes along and here's this sudden fall off at the high end, and it starts saying, well, let me recover that. Let me push that up. So that's why it makes this peak right here. And we don't want that. So if I drag this exclusion band over while it's playing, you're going to see that that peak suddenly calms down. And that's all I was trying to do, was calm down this peak a little bit. So that's how to think of using these, is if you see some really weird thing Gullfoss seems to be doing over on the extreme ends, just drag these bands in to tone it down and get the shape you want. Ultimately, if you're feeding a good, clean spectral balance and mix into Gullfoss, Gullfoss isn't going to be working really hard. It's just not. You're going to see very small changes here. I mean, this is a 12 dB range here, so each one of these grids is 6 dB. So here's what Gullfoss is doing 300 times a second in real-time dynamic decisions. And you can see it's, only 2 or 3 dB of adjustment in its most extreme ranges, 300 times a second. And that's why it's doing some magic. It's doing some things you just can't accomplish with static EQ. So that's all about Gullfoss. If you're interested in Smart EQ2, let me explain this one now. I love this. I love this to death. It's awesome. Certainly as a mix bus EQ, but I think you can also use it on individual groups and buses or even individual sounds. If you're just not sure, you've done tricky sound design on something and you've layered 3 different things together and your goal is to try and fill out as much of the spectrum as possible with that layered combination of sounds. Sometimes, even if you're not going to actually use Smart EQ, it's useful to see what Smart EQ does to tell you how close you are to really filling out a good, smooth spectral balance for that layered set of sounds. And certainly this is true at the bus level. I mean, on your drum bus, a goal quite often with your drum bus is to really fill out the spectrum very evenly when all your drum sounds are cranking and happening together, because they just carry it in electronic music. It's your drums are everything. So seeing what Smart EQ wants to push up or wants to pull down can give you some clues about whether your leveling's out of balance or whether your EQ on a specific type of sound in the group is a little bit out of balance. Or you could just say, screw it, and just let Gullfoss fix your laziness and do it in one go on that bus or that group. And then, use Smart EQ in the same way on other groups. And then again, at the final mix bus level, have a Smart EQ up there, just doing whatever final tweaking might be necessary to really basically come right into line on a kind of spectral curve that's commonly accepted as a good reference curve. So Smart EQ basically works. You've seen the videos. I'm not going to tell you how it works. I'm going to tell you some tricks for using it, right? The basic idea is start with everything flat. Here, I'll just redo this track. Let me bypass Gullfoss so it's not in play. And I'm going to completely wipe this curve and even just go switch back to the default settings. Okay, so by default, Gullfoss looks like, Smart EQ looks like this and wants to act like this. I'm also going to turn on the meter so I can see what it's doing to the curve. And then the basic idea is go find a song section and click this button and keep playing that song section, keep looping it until this turns off and tells you it's done. And what I like to do so my ears aren't tossed around while Smart EQ is figuring out what to do, I bypass it while I'm doing that step. So I'm going to bypass it, play the mix, and click this button. Okay, so it's done. As you can see, it takes a while. It really listens. It really like keeps averaging in. It's got some routines working in the background there. And it's worth noting that there is a smoothing value for it. By default, it's 15%. I'm going to go 0 smoothing for a second just to show you. And you get to that through this little gear here. See all these little jaggies? That's what the algorithm under the covers really decided needed to change. Like it's finding resonances where all these little notches are. Let's zoom in a little bit. Okay, see? It's doing all these little notches where there's resonance, this tick, 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 like that. Those are resonances, and it's finding those peaks and sucking them down, right? Now, when you start smoothing the curve, of course, this becomes more gentle and less surgical, and you have the same sort of decision making to do in something like soothe, right? Soothe will let you get very surgical looking like this. Typically, though, you don't want this, and I kind of wish they would let you smooth it while looking at the curve, but let's go to like, 100% smooth, and it looks like that. If we go to 50% smooth, it looks like that. And if we go to 15% smooth, looks about like that. So 15 is the default. You can see a little bit of bumpy jaggies here, right? I honestly just keep it at the default. To me, the default sounds great. It makes good decisions. It will by itself clean up some harsh resonances, and then Gullfoss will just take that a step further and really get rid of them. But Smart EQ does a good job. So by default, Smart EQ comes up with this curve. And then from there, you've got these bands for the ends that can affect, whether you like how extreme it's getting at the ends. That's one way to do it. So let me drag this over from roughly about 58 hertz. And you can see that as I take it down here, it's actually acting harder on the sub frequencies because it says, well, I really want to take those down because there's some rumble happening down here. So let me really take those down. Well, you can choose to do that or not, but by default, it basically says, don't go too hard on the sub, right? Leave the sub alone because some people like their sub, right? Same on the high end. If I move this up from 567K, right? You can see it's scooping more of the highs out because it's acting harder on them. So just like Gullfoss, you can use this to kind of adjust what the extreme ends are doing. And then you can take any given band and just influence it. These outer ones are shelves, high and low shelves. The inner ones are bells. And so you can just ever so subtly adjust with your ears what Smart EQ decided to do by itself, right? And then you can even on the outer ends, there's low pass and high pass filters that you can adjust even more. And that's one of the things I did with this song. So with Smart EQ, my experience is stick with the default, use the standard profile, which is also the default, because they have all these profiles for analog instruments, acoustic instruments. They don't have anything in here for electronic dance music. And since I'm working on the mixbus here, I'm using the standard EQ curve. And I've done some testing on it. Well, I'm not going to go into that. Just use the standard profile. Let it do its thing. Don't change the strength. I think the default of 75 is good. I think the default width is generally good. And just, if there's something in the sound you want to tweak a little bit, just grab these little influencer nodes. They're not really EQ nodes per se. They're influencing what Smart EQ did, right? Play with those. get it to your liking, or alternatively, by the way, this will make everything flat again, right? I just like dragged everything down to the center, even the smart band, which is this green one. Let me just pull the strength back up to 75% for the smart band. Okay, so now it's back where it was. Another thing you can do is just play with the smart band and say, well, I don't want it quite that much adjustment. I want a little adjustment or a lot of more than you gave me originally, right? Just play with your smart band. And as you can see, dragging this will also change where it sits. So I like to typically just use the strength slider to pop it up and down. I think there's a modifier key like shift or something that will let you drag up and down without accidentally drag it off to the side, but I never remember that modifier. So I say just use Smart EQ by itself. Subtle adjustments here as you desire. And you can even save it as, a new preset if you want for some reason. And here's the other fun thing about Smart EQ is it has states. It has 9 different states or snapshots. And so you can go through your song and let's say your intro has one tonal blend, right? You can run Smart EQ on your intro and come up with its curve and then click a little plus sign to save it to slot number 1. And then you can just blank it out again and go find your build-up or your next section that's fundamentally different in its overall balance and spectral characteristics, and you can run it again. And then when it comes up with a new curve, you can click the plus sign to save it into state number 2 or snapshot number 2 and so on. And so you can walk through as many as 9 different sections in a song that are all fundamentally different from each other and make a custom Smart EQ curve for every one of them. And then this is exposed through automation in your DAW, and you can have an automation track, an automation lane on your master track, and just snap it through whatever state you want for that particular thing. It doesn't really take that long actually to do that, and it's not that hard to set up. So you might find that worthwhile, because a common complaint about any kind of static EQ on the master bus or the mix bus is that, well, you set it up for your big loud drop section and then it's the wrong kind of EQ tweaks for a quiet intro, or it's the wrong kind of EQ tweaks for a bridge or a mellow breakdown or something, right? So Smart EQ lets you just set up a bunch of snapshots using its brain, and it makes good decisions, as you heard at the beginning of this video. And then you can automate through. And then Gullfoss, hey, you don't need to mess with any of that, because Gullfoss just takes whatever you feed into it and just makes 300 decisions every second and tweaks things in the fashion that we've described. So that's everything I have to say about Gullfoss and Smart EQ. I think they're both good. I'm pretty sure Smart EQ2 might be on sale still on Plugin Boutique for only $69. So if you're watching this close to my release date, go check that out. Maybe you can snag this at a good price. And that's it. Thanks for hanging in here. See you next time.